How do you convince someone to try a new set of wargame rules when they don't really care about the historical period, or perhaps aren't particularly interested in the style of game that you're putting on the table? Is it the mechanics that win them over, the spectacle of the miniatures, the narrative that you build around the scenario, or something else entirely that makes the difference between polite interest and genuine engagement? So today I want to explore some of the most effective ways to introduce new rules to reluctant players, because teaching a game is often just as important as designing it or playing it. And in many cases, it's the moment where a new rule set either takes off in a group or disappears back onto the shelf. And this is one of those topics that keeps resurfacing in the hobby conversation again and again, and for good reason. It shows up in club conversations, in comment sections, at shows, and in those familiar post-game discussions where someone says, "I'd love to try that, but I just don't quite get it," or "I'm not really into that period." Most of us at some point have been in the position of having discovered a brilliant new set of rules, carefully reading through them, painting up forces, building a scenario and imagining a great evening of gaming, only to find that when we actually invite other people to the table, the reaction is a bit more hesitant than expected. Enthusiasm, unfortunately, doesn't always transfer directly from one person to another, and a rule set that feels exciting in your head can sometimes feel intimidating or irrelevant to someone seeing it for the first time. Part of the challenge is simply the sheer breadth of historical wargaming itself. We move across thousands of years of history, from ancient warfare to modern conflicts, and we do so using systems that range from ultralight skirmish games that can be picked up in half an hour to deeply detailed simulations that demand careful study and patience. The variety is one of the great strengths of the hobby, but it also means that when someone is being introduced to something new, they're not just learning a game, they're often stepping into an entirely unfamiliar mental space. The good news, though, is that this does not need to be a barrier. In fact, the most successful introductions I've seen rarely begin with rules at all. They begin with experience, with curiosity, and with creating a situation where people want to engage before they've even fully understood what they're engaging with. One of the most common mistakes when introducing new rules is assuming that everything needs to be explained up front before any dice are rolled or any miniatures are moved. It's a very natural instinct. Done it myself, especially for those of us who enjoy reading rule books and thinking through systems in detail. To want to make sure everybody understands how everything works before the game begins. The problem is that this often front loads the experience with too much information. Even a well-designed rule set can become intimidating if it's delivered as a lecture rather than as an activity. By the time the first turn arrives, players may already feel like they're trying to remember too many things at once. A far more effective approach is to strip things back to a simplified or core version of the rules for the first game. Many modern systems already provide quick start guides or introductory scenarios for exactly this reason, and even if they don't, it's usually possible to create a stripped down version that focuses only on the essential mechanics. Movement, shooting, close combat, maybe a simple morale system is often more than enough for the first outing. The important thing is not to showcase every nuance of the rule set, but to get players interacting with it as quickly as possible so that the rules begin to make sense through play rather than explanation. Closely linked to this is the idea of pacing the introduction of mechanics. Rather than presenting the entire system in one go, it can be much more effective to introduce rules gradually over the course of a game, or even across multiple games. The first session might only involve movement and combat, with everything else temporarily set aside. The next time you play, you might add in morale or command mechanics and so on. This approach mirrors how people naturally learn complex activities in other areas of life. Nobody expects to learn every aspect of driving, cooking, or playing a musical instrument in one sitting, and wargaming benefits from exactly the same incremental approach. Each new layer then has something concrete to attach itself to, rather than existing as an abstract rule in isolation. Once the basic structure of play is in place, one of the most powerful tools we have as players and teachers of games is narrative. It's often said that people don't remember rules, they remember moments. I've said it myself many times. A narrative is what turns a sequence of mechanics into a memorable moment. Many players who are not initially interested in a historical period may not connect with dates, unit designations, or organisational structures. but they will absolutely connect with a story about a desperate defence, a last-minute counterattack, or a unit trying to achieve something meaningful under pressure. Instead of presenting a unit's capabilities in purely mechanical terms, it's far more engaging to frame their actions within the context of what is happening on the table. A movement value becomes a desperate advance to seize a vital crossroads before enemy reinforcements arrive. A shooting mechanic becomes a brief, chaotic exchange of fire across the hedgerow where every shot might determine the outcome of the engagement. Once players start thinking in those terms, the rules stop feeling like abstract systems and start feeling like tools for telling a story, which is where historical wargaming often becomes most compelling. Another key factor in successfully introducing new rules is the physical presentation of the game itself. A well-set table does a huge amount of heavy lifting before a single rule is explained. People are naturally drawn to the visually appealing setups, and a game that looks coherent, well-structured and inviting will often spark curiosity even in those who have no prior interest in the period or system being used. This is one of the reasons demonstration games at shows can be so effective, because they allow people to approach something that already feels alive and understandable before they've even engaged with the mechanics behind it. Once players are at the table, demonstration style teaching becomes incredibly powerful. Rather than explaining everything in advance, you can introduce rules as they become relevant, allowing the game itself to act as the guide. When a unit moves, you explain movement. When combat occurs, you explain combat. This contextual learning tends to stick far better than pre-game explanations, because players are immediately applying what they hear rather than trying to store it for later use. It also keeps the game moving, which is important because momentum is often what keeps people engaged during their first experience. Supporting this process with simple visual aids can make an enormous difference. Reference sheets, quick guides, clearly laid out summaries reduce the need to constantly stop and consult the rulebook, which helps maintain flow and reduces the feeling of uncertainty that new players often experience. The less time someone spends searching for information, the more time they spend actually playing and making decisions. And that sense of involvement is what usually turns a hesitant first game into genuine interest. Now, beyond mechanics and presentation, there's also a human element, which is arguably just as important. Having an experienced player guide newcomers through a game can transform the experience entirely, not by telling them what to do, but by providing reassurance, answering questions, and gently explaining options as they arise. The best mentors in the hobby tend to do very little actual directing and instead focus on making sure the new player feels comfortable enough to explore the rules without fear of making mistakes. And just as important is the overall atmosphere around the table. If the environment feels relaxed, welcoming and focused on enjoyment rather than perfection, new players are far more likely to engage. Mistakes become part of the learning process rather than something to be avoided at all costs. And that shift in mindset can be the difference between someone enjoying their first game and someone feeling overwhelmed by it. Now, providing a bit of historical context can also help bridge the gap for players who are not initially invested in the period. It doesn't need to be an academic lecture or a deep dive into military history, but even a brief explanation of what the scenario represents or why the battle matters can add weight to the game. When players understand the why behind what they're doing, the how tends to follow more naturally. Now, equally important is being open to feedback. Different players learn in different ways, and what works for one group may not work for another. Some people prefer structured explanations, others prefer learning through play, and others need time to process information at their own pace. Being willing to adjust your approach based on how people respond is one of the most effective ways to improve future teaching games, because it turns the experience into an ongoing conversation rather than a fixed presentation. At the end of the day, introducing new rules is less about transferring information and more about creating experiences that people want to return to. The rules themselves matter, of course, but what tends to stick with players are the moments, the decisions, the unexpected outcomes, and the shared stories that emerge around the table. If we can create an environment where those things happen naturally, then even the most reluctant player can find themselves drawn into a new period or system without really realising when the shift happened. So the question I'd like to leave you with is this: What has worked best for you when introducing new rules or new periods to other players? Have you found certain approaches that consistently succeed, or have you had experiences where things didn't quite land the way you'd expected? Please share your thoughts, your successes and even your disasters in the comments, because it's one of those areas where everybody's experience adds something useful to the conversation. That's it for this week. Please join the chat in the comments and don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell for your weekly fix. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming and of course, keep rolling high.